All right. I had the email and the link on queue to send out this afternoon, and then I just forgot. If for whatever reason I do not send a link out, the Zoom link does not change from week to week. So if I don't send one out, go back. You can use an old link. It'll get you to the same place. So again, I'm going to try to remember that, but if for some reason I don't send out the link, or it gets lost, or you accidentally delete it, all you have to do is just go back to an old one, click on the Zoom link for Gracebook, and it just, I don't change it. And I do that intentionally. So for those of you who are here in person, these are the new Lent devotional books that we're going to be handing out on Sunday.
You want to take one.
So there's some in the back, so grab one of those. For those of you who are online, you can grab one on Sunday, 40-day devotional. So make sure you grab that on Sunday. Just wanted to, what's that?
Who's the author?
Kyle Jones and Catherine Strouch. I don't know them personally. I know the guy who wrote the foreword. I know the publishing company. I read through a number of them online before I purchased them. So nice and simple, but I think pretty well done. So. All right. Oh, also, did somebody here last week grab a lesson 3, but only the first page? Because this was left.
There was just one page out there.
Oh, there was.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe it just got separated. Okay. I just want to make sure everybody has.
Yeah.
You should have pages 15 through 20 for lesson 3. If you just have page 15 and 16, let me know. I got the rest of your lesson. Everybody okay? All right. Okay. All right. We are starting lesson 3, Gracebook, God's Creating Power. Are there any questions before we begin that, though?
I guess I have a logistical question.
Okay.
Is there going to be a Gracebook class next week?
No. Good question. Thank you for the reminder. Next Wednesday is Ash Wednesday. So we'll have that instead. So no class next week. Thank you, Jason. Appreciate that. I would have forgot. All right. Okay. Well, let's begin then on page 15. We're going to be looking at this question. Where did everything come from? Imagine for a moment that you're hiking up in the mountains and you run across a picture, or you run across a cabin. You're looking at a picture of this. What are some things that you can surmise about the cabin's origins just by looking at it?
Somebody built it.
Okay. You probably, like, maybe you can come up with like a relative date. Like, this looks like the colonial style of the 60s or whatever it was, or the 20s, or, maybe you've got a better eye and you can kind of, the history of the place. You can maybe even tell where some of the logs came from, the type of wood that it is. There's a lot of things that you could probably surmise about its origins, but the one thing maybe that we kind of just know instinctively, and so we assume and don't even think twice about it, is the fact that someone built it. You don't stand there in front of this log cabin and go, wow, it's amazing how all of the trees kind of just fell over on top of each other and formed these like perfectly, crisp 90-degree angles, and the shingles just kind of blew in with the wind and landed on the roof. No, it's so obvious, and you don't even think about it. Somebody built this, right? And I think that's something that we maybe kind of overlook too when it comes to really sort of everything, right? You look at this and you would say, wow, think about the amount of work and effort that it took to build something like that out there, probably with minimal amount of tools, minimal amount of help, minimal amount of technology. So that simply by studying the structure, by studying the cabin, you can actually learn something about the architect, about the builder. This took a lot of skill. This took a lot of time. And so what we're going to kind of get at tonight is the fact that, yes, while we look at a building, while we look at a piece of art, while we look at, a piece of machinery, whatever it is, we might be fascinated by the thing, by the art, by the structure, by the machine. And yet the reality is that it really also tells us something about the person who built it, right? And the Bible says this, Hebrews chapter 3, verse 4, every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything. And again, we understand that first part. That's kind of a given, right? Every house is built by someone. Duh, right? But we take a step back and we kind of zoom out, and the Bible says, but then I just as easy as it is to make that assumption about a house and its builder, I want you to zoom out and recognize that the same is true for the entire universe. That God is its ultimate builder, its creator, its architect. So that's what we're going to talk about in lesson 3. Our goal in this lesson is to discover what the Bible has to say about our origins. After we study the Bible's explanation for our existence, we will compare that message to a number of scientific facts to see if the Bible and science are in agreement or conflict with one another. And I think that's something that I always find really fascinating, is a lot of people think that if you're going to be a Christian, you have to check your brain at the door, that there's no science that supports Christianity. And we'll look at this a little more when we get into a future lesson on the Bible. But one of the sayings is that Christianity's greatest friend is archaeology. That the more we dig up and the more we study and the more ruins we find, the more the Bible is proven true. And so I think there's something to say about that when it comes to science too. So we'll get there. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to get to the beginning of the Bible, Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And we're going to look at the first week of creation and just simply listen to how the Bible describes the origins of our universe. So here's chapter 1, verse 1. Here's how the Bible begins. Okay. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning the first day. So if we're looking at this, what is it that God is creating on day 1? Kind of a hint for each of these. Whenever God says, "Let there be," it's whatever follows that. So day 1, it's "Let there be light." God is creating light. In our last lesson, we talked about the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And I think it's interesting just to note that the Bible credits the work of creation to each person of the Trinity. That it's not just something that the Father does, but the Son doesn't, or the Spirit doesn't. They're all there. They all participate because God, again, is the creator of everything. So 1 Corinthians chapter 8, in your notes there, Paul says this, "Yet for us there is but one God, the Father, from whom all things came and for whom we live." Okay? So everything came from him. He is the creator, the originator, the author of everything. Colossians chapter 1 says this about the Son, about Jesus. "For by Jesus all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him." Sounds very similar to what we just heard about the Father, right? Finally then, Psalm 104, "When you send your Spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the earth." And that's a picture that almost takes us back to this moment in creation, where the Spirit is hovering over the waters, the deep, right? He's there in the darkness, renewing the creation. So that is day one. All right. Light, need that to begin. Here's day two. Verses 6-8, God said, "Let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it, and it was so. God called the expanse sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. So what do we have on day two? We've got this separation of water above and water below. And I think for us, this is easy enough to understand. We recognize, I mean, my goodness, walk outside right now, there's water up above us, right? It's raining down on us right now. But I think even just this, I noticed this when I'm up in an airplane and I'm flying at 35,000 feet and you see the condensation build up on the windows, right? You're flying through water, right? It's not as dense, it's not as compact, it's not as much as if you were like actually in water, but it's there, water above, water below. Now, I don't think it's the same way now that it was at creation. And we're going to get into this a little bit later on. And I say that simply because we sort of get the impression that when the flood happens in Genesis chapter 6, that the flood not only is something that comes from above, but also below. And it's not just that it rained really, really hard for 40 days and 40 nights. That was one of the things I always struggled with when I was younger. I've been in torrential downpours, and I'm thinking 40 days and 40 nights of the heaviest rain I think that's ever been recorded. I don't think that would be enough to flood the Mount Everest. But that's not really the way the Bible describes it. Number one, it says the geysers of the great deep burst forth. I mean, this picture of like volcanic water erupting on the earth. And then it also talks about how the floodgates of the heavens were opened. So when we talk about this water above and water below, I actually do kind of envision there being almost this water that kind of surrounds the globe. And some people have talked about it kind of being this water canopy that maybe God used to kind of heat everything evenly around the earth. Could have been. Ultimately, we don't know exactly what it was. But I think it's easy enough for us to look at it and say, water above, water below, what's the expanse between them? God calls it sky. And so this is what we've got on day two. If you turn the page to page 16, you see there Genesis chapters 2, verses 5 and 6. We're going to look at this briefly in the next section. But we see this: no shrub of the field had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth. But streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. And so there's almost like this kind of natural irrigation built into God's creation, that water rises up and waters the plants and vegetation. And again, we still see evidence of this, right? I don't know if any of you are fans of, I forget the show. Who was the guy who would get dropped off in the middle of like the Amazon or, the Sahara Desert, and he's got to survive for like a week? Survivor Man, maybe that's what it was. And that's one of those things when you're out in the desert and you have no water. Where do you go to look for water? Well, you dig down, right? Because there's these rivers, there's these streams, there's water underneath the surface. So we still see evidence of this. Genesis chapter 7, this is what I was talking about in the flood. It says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were open. That's the picture, right? You've got this massive amount of water flooding the earth from below and above. And I think it all goes back to this idea at creation that God separates water above and below. And now he's really unleashing that water from above and below to now fill the earth and cover it. Okay? All right, on to day 3. God said, let there be water under the sky, let the water under the sky be gathered into one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds, and it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it, according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, the 3rd day. So what is God creating here on day 3? Well, he's creating dry land, right? He's separating dry land from water. So we've got dry land, and then on that dry land, I'm creating plants, vegetation, fruits, trees, all of those things that we would put into that category. This is interesting. The first bullet point there in your notes under day 3, 7 times in this chapter, in Genesis chapter 1, we meet some variation of the phrase, according to their kinds. We just heard it a number of times in the last section we just read. The Hebrew word translated kind is roughly equivalent to our scientific classification of family. If you remember back to biology class, you had to kind of memorize these, right? Species, genus, family, order, class, subphylum, phylum. And you start out really general, right? Species. So, right, we are mammals as human beings. That's our species, right? But so are whales, right? We're not of the same family, right? So you start general, and then you start getting more and more and more specific, right? So what I think is interesting here is the word that the Lord uses for kinds is sort of right in the middle. It's not as though God is saying, all right, I'm going to create a species, mammals, and then just kind of see how it shakes out. Whales can turn into humans and vice versa. No, God gets more specific than that. At the same time, I don't think we have to get this picture in our minds that God created every single type of spider and ant and bird that now exists today or has ever existed. I think some of those things can evolve if you understand that word correctly. I don't mean jumping from one, kind of species to an entirely different one. But I mean, I think there are things, adaptation, stuff like that happens that I think is a part of this. So according to their kinds. Now, here's the question that I have. What is God saying when he repeatedly tells us he creates plants and animals according to their kinds? Because again, I think when something is repeated this many times, you kind of have to step back and ask the question, why? Why does God keep repeating this? We're going to look at it a little later, but this is a part of what we would refer to as being the law of genetics, the scientific law of genetics. And the law of genetics says this, that when it comes to procreation or reproduction, whichever word you want to use, I prefer procreation, but reproduction is probably more commonly used in the scientific world. You can't go from one family to a different family. Meaning, how many times are you going to have to breed a set of dogs before they produce a litter of kittens? It's not going to happen, right? The law of genetics says so. How many times will you have to plant an apple seed before an orange tree grows? It's not going to happen, right? And the law of genetics says so. That there's these scientific laws that we look at in nature and say, look, there are no known exceptions to this. When you plant an apple seed, you're either going to get nothing because you didn't water it or take care of it, or you're going to get an apple tree. Like, those are your only options. Now, you can cross-pollinate and do all kinds of things. You can come up with some crazy kinds of apples, right? But there is this order that within the genetics of a certain living organism, you're not going to get something outside of that parameter from this seed or from this egg and sperm. And so what I think is fascinating to me about this is we see how God speaks in creation, and we see science supports it. And so, you know, you look at it and say, well, how did these scientific laws come into being? So, you know, how many times, if I had a pen, how many times would I drop this pen before it just stops halfway and doesn't fall any further? Well, never. It's always going to, because of the law of gravity, right? Well, why does the law of gravity exist? Right? What we see here in Scripture is because God says so, because this is how God creates. He doesn't just create apple trees. He creates the laws by which apple trees will continue to produce more apple trees. And the law of genetics says, yes, this is how it works. And we know of no known exceptions to that. That's why it's a law. So we're going to run across this phrase again, according to their kinds, when we get to the animals too. God's going to say, I'm going to do the same thing with animals. Again, you breed 2 dogs, you're never going to get a cat, right? You're never going to get, you can get really strange kinds of dogs, right? By breeding 2 different kinds of dogs. But you're never going to get something that's not a dog, right? I remember when I was a kid, one of my favorite things, I hated going grocery shopping with my mom, but she didn't like to go alone. So I was the youngest, so I oftentimes had to go with her. But my favorite part of grocery shopping was always getting to the checkout aisle and seeing the front cover of the National Enquirer. You remember that magazine? I don't even think it exists anymore. But my favorite one, I still remember this as a kid, was the story about Bat Boy being born. And I don't mean Bat Boy as in like the superhero. I mean like a kid that looked like a bat. And of course, you know, everybody looked at that and thought like, ha, 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 very funny, right? But this is what we're talking about, right? That doesn't happen, right? You can find a way to breed with a bat, I guess, if you want. You're not going to come up with a Bat Boy. It's going to be that jump. It's going to be that cross in species. So, all right, enough on that. Day 4. Verses 14 through 19. God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, the 4th day. All right. So what do we have here on day 4? We've got sun, moon, stars, planets, the things that we look up and see in the vast expanse of this sky that God has created. God now fills the sky. He fills it with what he calls lights. And why is it that we don't have a reference to any of the other planets? I think, personally, the reason is because the focal point of the creation is ultimately going to be human beings. The crown of God's creation is going to be mankind. It's going to be Adam and Eve. And so the focus then of the story of creation is ultimately what God is creating for the blessing and benefit of the crown of his creation. And while I'm not saying that the planets don't serve a purpose for us, I mean, to have a planet, I always forget the order. Is it Mercury? That is the gravity rich planet. That's where the majority of like asteroids go, so they don't just explode the Earth. They serve a purpose, but not like the sun, the moon, and the stars, right? That help give us light, that help guide us, that, as the Lord says here, dictates days and times and hours and seasons, right? All of those things. So God is now really giving a name and a source to the light that he created on day one. God is saying this is going to be now where the light comes from. And some people, people who are smarter than I am, have pointed this out to me. They say, well, here's a problem with the Bible and science. It refers to the moon as being a light, when the moon really isn't a light. It doesn't have its own source of light. It's simply a reflection of the sun. And I say, that's a good point. At the same time, when you walk out at night, what is it that ultimately gives light on the earth? Even if it's borrowing that light from the sun, you look up and say, wow, I can see because of the moon, right? So I think the point of it here is just to say God creates them for this purpose. He's not getting into the scientific explanations of where everything comes from, but just simply the sun, the moon, and the stars are going to give light on the earth. And they do. I think this is something, as you kind of look up into the sky, and I think of this every time we got our kids a little telescope, you know, and so on clear nights, we can go out and we can look at stars, and we can, you know, sometimes even see other planets and things like that. And you ask the question, you know, why is the universe so big and awesome? And you really can't study the universe without asking that question, without getting that kind of impression. I've never listened to, you know, an astrologist or an astronomer, you know, kind of say, you know what, I think I'm going to go into a different field because this is just really boring stuff. There's just not a whole lot to study out there in the universe. No, I mean, it is unknowable, really, this universe that we exist in. And so how is it, why is it that the universe is so big and so awesome? The Bible answers that. It says this, Psalm 19, verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. And kind of similar to what I was talking about at the beginning of the lesson, you know, when you look at Mona Lisa, I use that as an example because it's maybe the most well-known piece of art. I really don't think it's that impressive. But when you look at say the Sistine Chapel, right? And you look up at the arches and the domes and you see the paintings, or you go into an art museum and you see this amazing artwork. It's not just the art that should impress you. Someone wasn't just walking by a canvas and kicked over a can of paint by accident. And now you've got the Mona Lisa. Now you've got the Sistine Chapel. Now you've got, you've got Van Gogh. No, it all comes back to there's an artist. The beauty of art says something about the skill and gift and beauty of the artist. So when we look out and we are amazed at a sunset, or at snow-capped mountains, or the calm of the ocean, or the majesty of the stars and the universe in which we live, God says, I made this all awesome so that you would step back and go, I wonder who the awesome artist is. And Psalm 19 verse 1 here says, this is who it is. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. This is why the universe leaves us awestruck, because our God leaves us awestruck. All right. How could the stars be seen if they were light years away from the earth? Kind of another scientific question, right? If the stars, right, it takes light years for the light to go from the star to the earth. But when God speaks about them, right, he just says they're there and they're visible from the earth. And again, I would say, well, go back to day one, and what does God have the power and ability to do? Create light. So he not only creates the source of light, he not only creates the stars, but he creates them for this purpose, to give light on the earth. And so God also then creates the light between the star and the earth. And this is something we're going to see when we get to the end of creation here shortly. God doesn't create the universe and then tell Adam and Eve, you know what? Give it a couple light years, or even, give it a couple rainy seasons, and all the seeds and plants that I put in the ground for you. Eventually, this is going to be a really beautiful place for you. Eventually, it's going to be very useful and beneficial for you. But you got to give it time. No, when God creates his creation, he also gives the creatures, the things that he creates, their purpose. And so God creates apple trees, and God creates stars and the light that they shine on the earth. And so this is one of the things I think when people come back and say, okay, so if you're a Bible-believing Christian and you say that the age of the universe is somewhere but 6 to 10,000 years roughly, they would say, well, then why does it look like it's 1 billion years old? And I say, well, I think it's because if you had been there on the seventh day of creation, when God rested and everything was done, and somebody asked you, how long do you think this has all been here? You've got the sun in the sky. You've got big, mammoth trees giving you shade, full of fruit. Adam and Eve themselves, I don't think we envision them as being infants or babies, right? I picture kind of like young to mid teenagers, right? And yet they were a day old. The universe was a week old, and yet you would have said, this has been here forever. So extrapolate that now out 6, 7, 8, 9, 10,000 years. Well, of course, we shouldn't be shocked that it looks like it's a billion years old, multiple millions of years old. Because if you had been there when it was a day old, you would have said the same thing. Because this is the purpose for which God created, right? So then the question is oftentimes asked, okay, well then is God trying to trick us? If people walk away and they have this conclusion that the universe is 1 billion years old because it looks like it's 1 billion years old, is God then trying to trick people? And my answer to that is no. Well, then why does the creation come with this appearance of age? And my answer to that question is because God does everything well. Think about the first miracle that Jesus performed. Anybody remember which one that was? Which one? Yeah, when Jesus turned water into wine, right? So Jesus and his mom and some of his disciples are invited to this wedding celebration. And what happens? The absolute worst thing that could happen, right? At a Jewish wedding in the first century, they ran out of wine. And so Mary, I think she has some knowledge as to like, my son has the capability to do things that really no one else does. She obviously does, because she comes up to Jesus and says, hey, they ran out of wine. Meaning, can you do something about this? Like, what are you expecting him to do? And Jesus says to his mother, my time has not yet come. And yet, Jesus then turns around and tells the servants to go fill up these giant jars with water. And they give that water then to the master of ceremonies, probably the father of the bride. And they say, hey, we got this wine. And do you remember what his reaction was when he took a drink? You did this backwards, right? This is the best wine I've ever had in my life. Why did we bring out the cheap wine first and save the best for? You're supposed to bring out the really, really good stuff when people still have their faculties about them and they can tell the difference between good wine and cheap wine. But they've been drinking now all day and they're not going to appreciate this really, really good wine. Well, what is it that makes the difference between cheap wine and good wine? Not only the person that makes it, not only the grapes and the area that you harvest the grapes from, but what is it that makes wine better? Time. If you know the difference between a bottle of wine from 1896 and a bottle of wine from 2022, right? Even if one was originally cheap and one is more expensive, the time is going to, you know, the more fermentation. So what is Jesus giving the impression then? That not only did he make wine, he made wine that is really, really, really old. Was it really, really old wine? No, it was 5 minutes old. Well, was the trick there, or the purpose there, that Jesus was trying to trick everybody at the wedding, that he had some stashed away money and smuggled in some really expensive wine as a wedding present for the couple? No, it's that when God creates, he does everything well. God doesn't make cheap wine. God is not going to create an unfit universe for the crown of his creation. Everything is going to be perfect. And to do that, the appearance of time is going to come with it. So anyway, hopefully that just kind of helps you think through some of these things. Day 5. Verses 20 through 23. God said, let the water teem with living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds. There's that phrase again, we're hearing it. And every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the water in the seas and let the birds increase on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, the 5th day. So what is God creating here on day 5? We've got kind of like he did, there's like this order to creation, right? What did God do right away? He said he created light, and then he separated water above and water below, and then he comes back and he kind of then fills the dry land with vegetation. So when it comes to animals, now what does he do? Well, he goes back to the above and below approach, right? The birds up in the sky and the creatures in the seas. Do you know what the word team means? Not T-E-A-M like a basketball team, but the word here, let the water teem. It's not a word that we use very often. It's a word that means to be full of something. Here's what I have in your notes there. Safe to say your creator knows what he's doing. Notice that the waters teem with sea creatures, but the sky does not teem with birds. What might be the case if that were the other way around? We'd never see the sun. There'd be no point in washing your car. You know, we'd all be living in an Alfred Hitchcock movie. We'd never want to leave if there were as many birds in the sky as there are creatures in the ocean, that would be a terrifying world to live in, right? But God fills the seas. They're teeming with creatures, but he doesn't do the same with the birds, thankfully. So I find that interesting. All right. All right, a couple more. Day 6. What is created? Verses 24 and 25 we're going to begin with. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, wild animals, each according to its kind, and it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. So we've got the animals above and the animals below, and now we've got what? Now we've got the animals in between, right? We've got all the land animals, livestock, reptiles, wild animals, right? Moving on, the rest of day 6. This is where it starts to really get important. Then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the air and all the creatures that move along the ground and everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food, and it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good, and there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. So what is God making on day 6 as well? Really the last thing that he creates? Mankind, right? We're later going to be told this is Adam and Eve. Chapter 2, we're going to look at the specific ways that God actually created Adam and Eve, unique and distinct ways. And notice the subtle allusion here. I'm back in your notes now. We talked about this a little bit back in our previous lesson. Notice the subtle allusion to the triune God in verse 26, right? That God says, let us make man in our image, right? There's this plurality to God, right? And of course, we know that as the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The term man here is the generic Hebrew term for mankind. So when it says, let us make man in our image, and then the next phrase says, in our likeness, and let them rule over, because the word there for man is just kind of the generic term for mankind. We don't even really use that word mankind anymore. We use the word humanity or humankind. But I want you to understand that there's a difference here, and you find this oftentimes in the Bible. You'll find just the word man when it's intended to refer to all people. And so, you'll find sometimes there'll be like more modern and updated versions of the Bible that will translate, the word mankind as people, something like that, right? But also recognize then that just as we do, or a little different than we do in English, Hebrew also has specific words when it wants to refer to man as opposed to woman. It uses different words for that. Right. So we don't have to kind of wonder in the Hebrew, is this a word that is being used to refer to all people, man, or man as opposed to woman? In Hebrew, that's very easy to tell the difference. In English, it's a little more different. It's a little different because we don't really have another word, right? Maybe if we would use the word male, right, as opposed to female, maybe something like that. That would kind of be similar. But you'll recognize that. So when you go through the Bible, you just kind of have to look at the context again and say, is this something that is used to refer to all people, mankind, or just man as opposed to woman? Because both are there. What does it mean that mankind was created in the image of God? This is really fascinating and important, because nothing else in God's perfect creation is given this title. Nothing else is given the beauty and the majesty of being created in the image of God. Representation, yeah, and definitely, yeah, we're going to get to that in much future lessons. But I think go back to what we looked at in our previous lesson. What is the image of God? Well, we're talking about a spirit. We're talking about God is invisible. So we can't be talking about a physical appearance kind of thing. It's not as though like, your kids resemble you. Because, well, they came from you. And so they've got your nose and your eye color and your hair color. That's not what we're talking about. It's not as though Adam and Eve somehow looked like God. The image of God is his righteousness, his holiness, his purity. He is set apart and unique from all creation in that sense, right? That he is God and nothing else is. And yet he gives a glimpse of that. He gives that his image, his righteousness, his holiness, he gives that to Adam and Eve. And so the image of God means, I think just an easy way to kind of remember this, means that Adam and Eve were created perfect, holy. And what I mean by that is that they were created without sin, right? They were created the way that God's law commands all people to be. God says, be holy, as I, the Lord your God, am holy. Well, Adam and Eve were created that way. They were created holy, right? And so I think that to me is kind of like this all-encapsulating image of God. Because what we're going to see in our next lesson, we're going to look at the fall into sin when Adam and Eve, eat from the tree that God commanded them not to, and they fall into sin. What happens then when Adam and Eve start having their own kids? We see that their children are now born in the image of their parents. The Bible says Adam had a son in his own image, in his own likeness. Because Adam and Eve have lost the image of God. They've lost that holiness, that righteousness, that sinlessness. And so this is something that is unique, right? This is something that is good for us to pick up on. It's not a small thing that God says, I create mankind in my image. And then you look at everything else that comes with that. And this is really kind of what you were talking about, Dawn. This idea that human beings are now going to sort of be the representation of God on earth. Not that we are godly, not that we are divine, but that God really is now going to accomplish his continuing work throughout creation, preservation, procreation, all of those things. He's going to do that hiding behind human beings. This is what we talk about when we talk about the doctrine of vocation. Call of being a husband, a wife, a father, a mother, a son, a daughter, employer, employee, a citizen, all of those things. That God is going to continue to get his good work done in his creation, hiding behind the masks of people, right? And so this is where I would say one of the many differences between somebody who believes in the biblical account of creation and somebody who believes in either atheistic or even theistic evolution is that we have a higher view of humankind. We hold human beings to higher standards. And the irony of this is whether you believe in creation or not, we all do this. This is why when one human being kills another human being, we put them in jail. But when, a mountain lion kills a gazelle, we don't track it down and arrest it. We are held to this higher standard as human beings. And it's not simply because we view human beings as the most highly developed animal, and so we should be held to a higher standard. No, it's because it comes back to this. Why is it that we can look at every other human being in the world, regardless of their race, their creed, their status, their social status, where they live, when they lived? Why can we look at every human being and say, that person has value? It all comes back to this. Because this is how God created mankind, in his image. And that says something about humanity than something more than it says about the animals, right? And so, even when you look at, the morality that we hold human beings to, where does that come from? Right? It's because we recognize this in creation, that mankind is made in the image of God, and God puts Adam and Eve in charge of all of it. Right? You guys are going to be the ones, you're gonna rule over the earth and subdue it. It's yours, right? So at the same time, you can eat beef, you can eat meat, and be a Christian. You don't have to be a vegetarian. They are here, right? Adam and Eve are vegetarians, right? This is why God says, "I give every green plant for food." Adam and Eve are vegetarians. Why? Well, because there is no death yet. Right? And the irony is going to be, when does really the first death take place? We're going to see in our next lesson, it comes after the fall into sin, when Adam and Eve try and take the plants and make little fig leaf garments for themselves that wouldn't have lasted them 5 minutes. God actually provides them with animal garments made of animal skin. God is the first one who takes life, but he takes animal life to provide for human life, the crown of his creation. And so you can have a hamburger guilt-free. At the same time, we have to recognize that as human beings, God has put us in charge of taking care of his creation. We shouldn't be needlessly and mercilessly killing animals either. We should do things that help and benefit the planet. We should recycle. We should do things like that, right? And so I don't want to come off as this, like, we're in charge, and so we can just kind of mow over the world because this is our playground. No, we can use and benefit from the things that God creates because we are at the top, not just intellectually, but in the order of creation. God says, human beings, you're at the top. You're my number one priority, and so all of this I give to you. And part of that then comes with the responsibility of taking care of it, right? All right, I want to finish the first week of creation here. So let's get to day 7. Genesis chapter 2, first couple of verses there. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in their vast array. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating he had done. So what does God do? He rests, meaning he stops. He's done creating, right? And you look at the bottom of page 16 in your notes. What does it mean that the Lord looked at his creation and concluded it was very good? This is interesting. Did you catch this? At the end of every day, like a broken record, we've got God looked at all that he had made, and it was good. It was good. The light was good. The plants were good. The seas and dry land were good. The animals were good. All of it was good. But it's not until he's done that we hear God say it's very good. And when God says something is very good, what does that mean? It's not missing anything. It's not lacking anything. It's perfect. It's just as God had planned. He had nothing missing, nothing left to do. And so the bottom of the page, those are the Hebrew words. We'll look at this more when we get into our lesson on the Bible. The Old Testament, of course, was originally written in Hebrew. And so Hebrew reads right to left. It's a little trippy. So reading right to left, the two words there are tov, me'od, literally good, very. That's what God says about his creation, that it is very good. Okay? All right, that is where we're going to stop for tonight. We'll pick up and finish this lesson off next week. We'll get into Genesis chapter 2, which is going to kind of actually go back into the first week of creation and fill in some of the gaps. Chapter 1 of Genesis is just day 1. This was created. Day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, all the way through the first week. Chapter 2 then kind of actually walks us back through and shows us with a little more detail, what did this look like? How did this actually come to be? So we'll look at that in Genesis chapter 2, and then we'll look more closely at this kind of creation, evolution, science. How do these things, what do they say? What does it mean? That's what we'll look at next week. All right, everybody?
Do we have any idea from when man, Adam and Eve were on the planet to where the fall? Do we know at all the
No.
time frame? We
No.
know nothing about.
No, yeah, the question was, do we know how long after the first week of creation that the fall into sin happened? I forget exactly. I think Luther says like it happened on day 8. Like it was immediate.
That's when baptism.
Right. And it, I think we do get the impression that it was pretty quick, right? That there isn't this kind of long, kind of drawn out process. But again, it could have been, right? It could have been weeks, months, years, but it seems like the kind of thing that happened relatively quickly after. And we'll talk more about that like I said, in our next lesson. How did the fall happen? Why did God create the tree in the first place? All that stuff we'll look at. Okay.
Pastor,
Good question. Yes.
next week could we? I was just
Oh,
wondering.
yes.
could we
No,
get
thank
your-
you. Yeah,
Oh, no.
Jason brought this up at the beginning. Sorry, not next week. No class next week. If you're able, come to church for Ash Wednesday, 6:00. The service will be, so no class next week. Thank you. So
Well, no,
thanks
but
for
in
reminding
2 weeks
George.
then I have a request for in 2 weeks.
Yes, 2 weeks.
I wanted to get your feedback on day 5, day 6, and I've had these discussions in the past, but I've never had your take on when we talk about creation and we talk about dinosaurs, for example. I know the Bible mentions the Leviathan, the behemoth, but I just wanted to get your insight on that, like how you interpret that.
Okay. Can we do that in 2 weeks?
Yeah, absolutely. 2 weeks.
Okay. All right, cool. Dinosaurs, 2 weeks. I don't have a whole lot to offer. I really don't. But I'll try and give you something. All right.
I've had that question asked of me in the past, so I just wanted to see what your take is on it.
Sure. Okay.
Somebody.
All right. My take is usually not worth much, but I'll give it to you anyway.
It's worth a lot to me.
All right. Sounds good, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay. Have a great week. Hope to see you Sunday.